Good evening, everyone. We continue from where we left off yesterday in the book of Second Samuel. We ended with verse 16, and we had seen how David executed the young man uh, of the son of Agar, who actually declared or confessed that he had actually helped kill Saul to put him out of his misery, and and we have seen that that was a capital punishment for taking the life of the anointed of God, God's Mashiach. And we have seen how sober and solemn and serious that crime is. Reminded us that twice David had the chance to do that, but he always withheld his hand to recognize and respect the anointing upon God's chosen. Even though at that time God had left Saul, he is nevertheless still recognized as the anointed of God. Now, as we come to this point, this is what we will call a custom that the Israelites have as they mourn for Saul. Now, we may think that Saul is a bad king or whatever may come through our minds, but the text tells us that there is a correct way of handling the situation because God's anointed had died. So just let me just put it here. God's anointed, and in this case, the Mashiach has died. And it was confirmed that he has died by the testimony of the young man, Amalekite young man, who also brought the crown and the bracelet. Now, in verse 17 onwards, it is a response to the fact that Saul had died. They were very distressed, very angry. We've read that David had actually shredded his clothes, his garment into pieces, and so did the men around them because they were so tormented by the fact of the loss. It was an exceedingly great loss of a king of Israel. Now, from verse 17 onwards, we would be able to get a glimpse of how Saul ought to be remembered, treated as in any one of God's anointed. So David sang this song of mourning over Saul and his son Jonathan, Jehonathan. Now, unfortunately, we have this phrase here, sang this song of mourning. We have it, it should be better described as uh, a chant, or he chanted, he wailed, or he lamented. These are verbs, right? These are verbs. Uh, he chanted a chant, uh, a wail, a lament. Now, why am I showing you this? Is that it has the root in the idea of chanting. And in this case, it's not just mere chanting and a repetition. Uh, it is a repetition, right? And the word sang is chant. Song of mourning is a lament. So this is a lamenting a lament, chanting a chant, wailing a wail. That is the way it's being described in the Hebrew, that the song itself is the product of the action. This tells us that David is not singing a joyful song of celebration. And it also tells us that in death, it is right to mourn over the loss of God's anointed. And that is how David is responding to the death of Saul and Jonathan together. And so it is a lament. There is no celebration, there is no joyful singing. And this is not much of a song, although it's called a song here. It would be better off as a lamentation, right? A lamentation or a repetition, something that you say over and over again, you chant over and over again, as a reminder of how sad the situation is. And this particular lamentation, and I don't particularly like the word song because it is not the word song in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, there is a word song, but it's not that kind of a song, which means that in our modern day language, we have to recognize this as a chant. That would be a better way of looking at this lament, a lament of and this one the lament of a lament or lamentation, right? That would be a noun. This is a noun, the product of the verb. So now I think we should be able to recognize that this is the way David is paving for us to recognize that Saul, while he actually became crazy over trying to kill David, and yet David can turn around and still honor Saul. Now, also recognize the fact that in an Oriental culture, Saul is far older than David, and in that sense, Saul is an elder. Saul is his elder, and not only that, Saul is his king. Saul is the anointed of God and is his king. Now, we may not also appreciate the fact that as king of Israel, you are number one. You have the absolute power to take somebody's life. And yes, Saul had the absolute power to take David's life. And so David ran for his life. But even at this moment of death, David was realizing that this is a loss to Israel. That is how intimate and how clear in the mind of David that the king of Israel, no matter who he is, must be respected, honored, and recognized as such. And so David had told them to teach the sons of Judah the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Yashar. So let me just explain this a little bit. The English is a bit queer at this point in time. And so first, to teach uh, the sons of Judah. Now, to teach is uh, lamed. So what we have here, we have lamad that goes on to the word lamed. And so this is the word lamed. Lamad in itself is to learn, but in a more intense form, it is to teach. And so that is how interesting Hebrew is. So David is telling them, teach the sons of Judah, and there is no morning song off. So I'm going to take this out because it does not exist in the Hebrew. They are to be taught the bow. Now, by bow here, this is the bow and arrow, like this. the bow and arrow. And the idea here is a reminder that that is actually how Saul and Jonathan had died. And so, behold, it is written in the book of Yashar. Now, the book of Yashar, it means that the book of the just or the righteous. So this is a book that was written. Now, the Jewish mind says that this is the book of Genesis. So I just leave it here. This is the Jewish interpretation. The book of Yashar is the book of the righteous, book of the just, a scroll that they recognize or they write down the just of God. So it is a book of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now that's how it's understood. Now we don't have this book. If there's a different book, we don't have this book. And so the book of Yashar is understood by the Jews as this particular scroll. Verse 19, he says, the beauty of your beauty, Israel, is slaughtered on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. A bit of challenge in the translation. And so we actually find this. Your beauty, Israel, it is uh, the beauty of Israel. That is how it would be understood. And they are, well, this word slaughtered. You can say that this word slaughtered is fatally wounded. It could also be understood as pierced, as by the arrow. And of course, you can also see this as slain. So the beauty of Israel is slain or is fatally wounded or is pierced on your high places. Now, this idea of on your high places, we could read this as on Mount Gilboa, which is a high place, the mountains at the eastern end of the Valley of Megiddo, where in chapter 31 of First Samuel, we read of them dying there. It could also be understood from a more figurative viewpoint. On your high places could also be understood as in your height of life, if it is figurative, right? So I'm just giving you some of the possible explanation. The next phrase here is how the mighty have fallen. The word mighty here is Gibor, the mighty. What I would say, the mighty ones, not just mighty, right? Let me just strike this off, and it should be seen as the mighty ones. It's in the plural. Why? Because we're talking about Saul and Jonathan. So how the mighty ones have fallen, and we would say that the idea of fallen here is in the idea of a war when you have fallen, you are slain, right? I think that would be a better way of looking at it. The mighty ones have died, have fallen down, have been cut down. I think that would be a better way of speaking, that they have been pierced. They fell down because they were pierced, right? So fallen. Verse 20, he says, tell it not in Gath. This word, tell it not in Gath, how should we say? We should say that do not report this, right? Uh, do not report this. Do not make known, right? Make known. So do not make it known in Gath. The second word is to announce or to bear the news, to proclaim. Bear the news. Not in the streets of Ashkelon. And proclaim here would be publishing the tidings, to cry out, to announce it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will celebrate. So let me just draw a line here. So we have an A and a B. We have an A and a B. Now understand, A and B means there are two statements that are actually saying the same thing, but slightly differently, but it's done for emphasis. It's talking about the same thing. So this means tell it not in Gath, do not make it known in Gath, do not bear the news in the streets of Ashkelon. These two are the cities of the Philistines, right? And so do not make it known there. Do not talk about it there. Or the daughters of Philistines will rejoice, the daughters of the uncircumcised. So the Philistines are also called the uncircumcised. And so the idea of rejoicing and celebrate, shamach, they are two different words, but they actually mean the same. They actually mean to jump for joy, right? To jump for joy. The other word here would be to rejoice, to brighten up. Basically, both of these will be to celebrate, because they will celebrate the death of the king of Israel. So say nothing there. Say nothing there. Now remember, at this point in time, David is in Ziklag. He is also in a city of the Philistines. But remember, the city of Ziklag was given to him and his men. And we were told that Ziklag also belongs to Judah even until the day that the book was written. But Gath, on the other hand, and Ashkelon, both are major cities in the Philistines. So the idea of verse 20 is to say nothing in their land. Do not allow them to celebrate the death of our king. That would be how verse 20 is saying. While that is to be recognized that the Philistines had actually killed Saul and Jonathan, David, in this lament, do not want this fact to be a point of celebration. We cannot ignore the fact, but we can avoid it as a point of celebration. That would be the case. All right. The beauty of Israel would be Jonathan, Saul and Jonathan as well in verse 17. Now in First Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 21, so it says now it turns the focus on the mountains of Gilboa. The mountains of Gilboa is, you can say in First Samuel chapter 31, is where Saul and Jonathan had died. And so there seems to be a sort of a curse, if you like, upon this place, because the place in Israel was not able to protect the king. So let there be no dew nor rain on you, or fields of offering, meaning there would be no fields of grain that people can actually harvest for the feast of the first fruits or for any purpose of the offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. Now we can say that this is like an A and a B. They are both talking about the same thing. They're talking about the shield of the mighty, the shield of Saul. Well, the shield of the mighty, and 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 I think this would be the shield of the mighty ones. Right, the shield of the mighty ones. This is in plural. It says that was defiled. Now, this word is defiled means was cast away. Right? Was cast away, was rejected, had failed. The shield of Saul was not anointed with oil. Let's see. The shield of Saul was not anointed with oil, and the idea here was that they would be talking about leather shields, right? Leather shields smeared with oil, so that if the arrows were to hit, it would slide off. And it appears that it was it was, what we say, it wore out, right? It wore out. And in that idea was worn out, there was no more oil, it failed. And the whole idea here was the shield was not able to protect Saul. And that's why he died. And so let there be no dew nor rain. Dew or rain is the moisture. There will be no grass there on the mountains of Gilboa. There will be no more fields there. And so the idea here is there will be no celebration. There will be no life in this area, because it is a memorial where Saul and Jonathan had died. Verse 22. From the blood of those slaughtered, slaughtered means slain. From the fat of the mighty, and read this as the mighty ones, as a plural. The bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unstained. Now, we can actually see this from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty ones. Jonathan's bow did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return. So the word blood here would be the life of the one slaughtered or pierced. And that would be both Saul and Jonathan from the fat. Now, the idea of fat here would be the well, I guess the blood or the marrow, we could say here. The marrow, the best part of the mighty ones. Both is actually talking about the same thing. So we have an A and a B. We're talking about the blood of the slaughtered, the fat of the mighty. This reminds us of the life of Saul and Jonathan. And then now we talk about the instruments of war, the bow of Jonathan and the sword of Saul. So it says, did not turn back, did not return unstained. The word return unstained means did not return empty. Or it was not in vain. And what it means here in this explanation, and this is also another A and B, it says that the implements, the tools of war that belongs to Jonathan and Saul were very effective. So in this lamentation, it is also to remind those who are chanting this to recognize that Saul and Jonathan are warriors. They are heroes, right? They are heroes of Israel. Verse 23. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and delightful in life, and in their deaths they were not separated. They were swifter than eagles, they were mightier than lions. So again, these are songs and we need to understand how they work. So we're talking really about Saul and Jonathan. We have one person here and two persons. And as such, they were beloved. The idea here is that they were very lovable, I guess you could call it, right? They were very lovable. So this word is very lovable. The second word here is delightful. And the word delightful here would be very sweet. This is naim, very lovely. Very agreeable. What else? Very pleasant. So what are we saying is that we are seeing that Saul and Jonathan are to be remembered as very, very nice people in their life, right? In life, right? In life, in their lives while they lived, right? And so this is a tribute, I guess you can call it, right? This is a tribute. And in their deaths, so we're talking about life, and in their deaths, they were not separated. The idea of separated is divided. And this means that Saul and Jonathan died together. And so it is a tribute to remember the goodness of the life of Saul and Jonathan, that in life they were great together. And understand this, that Saul had used Jonathan as his right hand general and executed whatever Saul had wanted. And in their deaths, both of them had died together as well. And so they are now remembered together. They are swifter than eagles. I guess you could say that they can fly faster than eagles. They are mightier than lions. They are more, how should we say? They have more strength than lions. And so this is another A and B, to remind us that they are heroes, right? Heroes. They are valiant, they are powerful, they prevail. And so that would be a way of looking at Saul and Jonathan. And you notice nothing bad is said about Saul and Jonathan. So the Hebrew way of remembering Saul and Jonathan is also in the death, to say good things about them, which is true. Verse 24 says, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with jewelry, who put gold jewelry on your apparel. We have a bit of a challenge in translation, but never mind, we will work it through. So it says, O daughters of Israel. This is directed to the daughters of Israel. Why? Because you remember when we were talking about the Philistines, don't let the daughters of the Philistines, daughters of the uncircumcised, rejoice. Because in lamentation, in lamenting the lamentations, women are usually there in the forefront of wailing and chanting and mourning. And so now the daughters of Israel are to mourn over Saul. So in this case, it is to weep. This is to shed tears, right? You are to weep in grief because we have lost the king of Israel. This would be to lament, right? This would be to mourn. So you can use all of these and over Saul. Now, please do not have any wrong understanding that Saul is so evil, so bad. No matter what has happened to Saul, in his death, he is honored as the elderly, the number one in the nation of Israel, the king, the Melech, and he's also the Mashiach, the anointed of God. And so they are to be recognized as such. And so Saul had done good things in the society. He had actually dressed you in scarlet, which is red. It doesn't mean with jewelry. It what it means here is with finery. Okay, doesn't mean jewelry. It means finery, luxury. And so this could tell us that it could be very colorful clothing, which means that the daughters of Israel are to remember Saul for giving them all these opportunities to celebrate and to wear beautiful dresses, who put gold jewelry on your apparel, golden ornaments. Now, jewelry here means ornaments. It could be rings, earrings, nose ring, hand ring, bracelets, on your clothes. And so this is to remember Saul, that Saul gave them reasons to celebrate. And now you have a reason to mourn over Saul. So, verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Now, again, the mighty. This is Giborim, the mighty ones, have fallen. Again, we recognize this word, fallen, slain, struck by arrow and fell and died. So this is the word fallen. In the midst of the battle, this battle is with the Philistines. So we are here to recognize Saul, that Saul is the mighty one who led Israel to war. And Jonathan is slaughtered. The word slaughter here is pierced. And so we could say this is with the arrow, killed in your high places. And so figuratively again, in his prime or height of life. Notice the lamentation is very much dedicated in honor of Saul and Jonathan, without saying anything bad about them, to recognize them as heroes and to chant this in their funeral. In our last two verses, it exposes us to the inner emotions of David. And so now he recognizes Jonathan. First, he talked about Saul. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul. And here in verse 26, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been a close friend to me. Your love for me was more wonderful than the love of women. So let us break this down a little bit. So it says, I am distressed for you. This I would be David. Now, if you recall, David and Jonathan are really bosom buddies. All right. And in such a way where Jonathan would give his life for David and protect David from Saul. It is that close, and they were crying when they had to separate. And so David now laments on Jonathan. So he says, I am distressed. The idea of distress here, how should we say? I am afflicted. I think afflicted. I feel very closed up, right? I feel very pressed together. So this is an emotional feeling. And he is mourning the loss of Jonathan. And he calls him my brother Jehonathan. So this is in recognition of calling Jonathan not just a friend, but a brother. You have been a close friend to me. So a close friend and a brother. is the A and a B. So, what is a close friend? The word close friend here is really not in English close friend. Okay. It literally means um, you are very delightful, right? Very beautiful, very lovely, very agreeable, very sweet. That is a kind of words that's used. So, it really, well, we could say that it's close friend, but it's more than that. So the Hebrew word doesn't describe it as a friend, and so the word close friend is an interpretation by the translator. And so David is now describing that you, Jonathan, is very delightful to me. You are a wonderful person. You have been very agreeable to me. When I need to run away, you protected me. You are so delightful, so lovely, so sweet. You know, it's that kind of a description of Jonathan. And so it's not just my brother, and this would be he would die for you. And so that is David's way of honoring the memory of Jonathan. The next phrase here is, your love for me was more wonderful than the love of women. So, what does this mean? Your love for me was more wonderful. The word more wonderful means this. It means more more marvelous, uh, extraordinary. It can also mean that it is, how would you say, it is unique. It is unique and very distinguished, right? Distinguished. Uh, I think if you look at it this way, it says, your love for me was very outstanding. I guess you could say that. Outstanding. Then the love of women. And David knows. If you recall, when David, at this point in time, we at least know of three wives, the daughter of Saul, and then we had two other wives that he married at the same time, from Carmel as well. So David knows the love of women. So let us break this down. Love. The word love here is ahav, right? Ahav, or I guess you could call it ahava, as a noun. And the idea of love in Hebrew is not the same as the love in Greek or in the Western culture. Uh, Love really means to be able to give of oneself, to protect, to provide, to guard, to give life, to ensure that there is continuity of life. That all of these are good meanings of ahava. So it is about protection, about provision, all right, about giving, and particularly giving of oneself. So you think of it this way: which of the wives of David would give their lives to die for David? Which of the wives of David, the women of David, uh, and you can say this is the love of wives, right? Which of the women of David would defy their father to protect him? But Jonathan did. Jonathan defied Saul. In Saul's anger, Saul knew that if Jonathan were to choose between Saul and David, Jonathan would choose David and protect him. And so this is a declaration of how good the love of Jonathan was for me, David. So it was extraordinary. It was marvelous. It's unique. It's distinguished. It's outstanding. It's better than my wives. You could say that, right? It's better than my wives. Because the Hebrew idea of love is ahava. That's love, ahava. It is to protect, to provide, to give of oneself. And that's exactly what Jonathan had done. And so this is a recognition of the immense love that Jonathan has for David. Our last verse is verse 27. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war has perished. Again, I point out to you, this one is the mighty ones. And this would refer to Saul and Jonathan. The weapons of war, the tools of battle of Israel. Right? Also, we read in verse 17, the beauty of Israel. This is an A and a B. Saul and Jonathan are known as the heroes, the mighty ones, right? They are the heroes. And they have fallen, they have died. The weapons of war are also referring to Saul and Jonathan. They are considered the tools of battle of the nation of Israel. The king of Israel always leads them into battle. That's the traditional role of the king. Not only sit back and rule, but in times of war to be in the front line, could be the first to be killed. And they are known as the weapons of war. In verse 17, they are known as the beauty of Israel, and they have perished. The idea of perished, avad here is die, right? Is die. Fallen is also die. And so in the conclusion of this lamentation is that Saul and Jonathan have died. There is no hiding the fact that Jonathan and or Saul and Jonathan have died. That's why they are having this chant, this wailing, this lament, and to speak good of King Saul and Jonathan, his bosom buddy, his brother, whose love, whose ahava was more outstanding than the love of wives or his wives, right? He has many wives. And the recognition, at least in conclusion, that Saul and Jonathan are the heroes of Israel. They are the weapons of war, the tools of battle. They are also the beauty of Israel, and they have died. We have spent a considerable time on this lamentation because we are in series 2. We will spend more time so that we understand the Hebrew, underlying Hebrew, and to draw out the meaning and the emotions of this lamentation as David is now exalting Saul and Jonathan. Nothing bad about them. Even when Saul was chasing down David, the reason why David is now in Ziklag was all because of Saul. And yet, David initiates the national memory, the national memorial, the national lamentation, the remembrance of Saul and Jonathan in their death. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.